Hi, I'm Joshua Farnsworth, and in this video, I'll talk about 5 features you should consider when building or buying a workbench for woodworking. If you're watching this video, then you're probably considering making or buying a workbench for your workshop. I've built a lot of workbenches over the years, including most of the workbenches here in my school. So I'd like to take a little bit of time and share my opinion on 5 features that I feel are important for woodworkers to consider before building or buying their own workbench. And I'd also like to dispel some commonly accepted dogma about workbench construction. And before I get started, I want to let you know that this video that you're watching goes along with my very popular tool buying guide articles. I'll share a link below this video to my guide on choosing a workbench design. My tool guides have a lot more detail than I have time to share in videos. And also in my guides, I mention specific brand names and models of tools that I prefer, which I don't like to do on videos so much because my opinion can change and it's hard to change videos. A lot easier to change articles. I'll also be making videos for all my other guides on buying hand tools and power tools. So if you subscribe to my YouTube channel down there, you'll be notified immediately when those videos are released, coming up here soon. All right, so let's jump into the 5 features that I consider to be the most important when choosing a workbench design. One of the most important features to look for in workbench design is sturdiness and stability. Hand planing and sawing on a cheap and flimsy workbench will become frustrating very quickly as you find that your workbench is moving and shaking across the room. In most cases, sheer mass and weight are usually the solution for a sturdy workbench, along with solid construction with good wood joinery, like mortise and tenon joints. You can see how a beefy workbench like this Roubeau style workbench has a massively heavy top and thick, heavy legs. A workbench like this does not move easily, trust me. I wish I'd taken a video of me flipping the beast over and back during this construction. You would have had a pretty good laugh, although I wasn't laughing at the time. So the Roubeau workbench style is one of my favorites. I think it looks really nice with the dovetailed joint there and the thick top. But the tops on a workbench like this are usually 5 to 6 inches thick. But a workbench top with 3 to 4 inch thick top will usually provide you with the mass that you need. I've found a couple commercial workbenches that are sturdy enough for hand tool work, but surprisingly not many. I've listed the models in my workbench guide for you to check out. But what if you don't have a suitable place to use a massive workbench like this? And what if you want a workbench that can be transported to a job site or a craft fair? Does that mean you have to sacrifice stability? No. That's where the ingenious portable Moravian workbench design comes in. This is probably my favorite workbench design. The Moravians were a religious sect in the 1700s up to modern time from Moravia. But they designed this portable yet sturdy workbench in the 1700s, and the folks at the Old Salem Moravian settlement in North Carolina have resurrected the design. The angled displayed legs incredibly keep this workbench from moving across the room when I'm hand planing, which is really nice. The workbench can be assembled or disassembled in under a minute. In fact, you should check out the video that I filmed of Will Myers where he assembled one of these Moravian workbenches in under a minute. I'll put a link below or it'll pop up here somewhere. Because of its lightweight, once it's taken apart, the Moravian workbench can be transported by just one person. I've made both slab tops and laminated tops for my Moravian workbenches, and I like them both. And I find that I can pretty easily carry all of them. They weigh probably around 70 to 90 pounds each. And the undercarriage parts are made of lightweight wood, but they're still sturdy because of the strong joints. And it's nice because you can save money not having to spend money on an expensive wood for your undercarriage. I had one person email me to tell me that he built a Moravian workbench, which he now transports up the elevator in his high-rise apartment in New York City. So it was a pretty cool and versatile bench. Will Myers, my friend, drew up some free plans for the Moravian workbench, which you can get on my workbench guide that I mentioned earlier. And because this is our favorite workbench design, Will and I also made a 7-hour video tutorial on making this workbench using hand tools. It's geared towards beginner woodworkers, but anybody will find it helpful. You can purchase the DVD or the high definition download at my store. I'll put the link somewhere here. Some of my friends really like their English style workbenches, as you see here. And I do like some things about this style. Like they have big aprons for flexibility and holding your workpiece with a hold fast. And they usually have nice legs and nice vises. And also they're pretty fast to build and pretty affordable to build. However, one drawback that's kept me from building one for myself is the thinness of the top, which doesn't feel as stable to me when I'm pounding on a joiner's mallet. And the biggest problem for me is it's also super loud because of the echo that's caused by the vibration of the thin wood. And I just couldn't have 10 workbenches here in my school with tops like that, or I'd be deaf in no time at all. It would echo off of the walls. But if you only need one workbench, it's not a bad option. The next feature I'll talk about are vises. Vises are used to clamp your workpiece to the workbench so you can plane, saw, or shape it in a number of ways. 1 or 2 vises are usually sufficient for a traditional workbench. Some very traditional woodworkers sometimes like to have 1 or even 0 vises, like people who are building a reproduction period Roubo workbench. But I prefer to have 2 vises myself, and I place them into 2 categories. A face vise points toward the furniture maker on the face of the workbench, and a tail vise is attached to the end of the workbench. And just so you know, other woodworkers may have different terminology than me for parts of the workbench, which is okay. So let's talk about face vises. There are a few different styles of face vises. The first style I'll talk about is a leg vise. A leg vise is one of the most common traditional vises that you'll find on antique workbenches. And this type of vise is attached to the front leg, or a board that's attached to the front leg, and it's tightened down with a wooden or a metal screw and a handle. A parallel guide with a metal pin keep the vise from racking or stretching too far to where it can break. This is my personal preference for a face vise because there's so much room to clamp wood without hardware getting in the way, like on some other vises. And I really like using historical wooden screws on my vises. Of course, you can check out my workbench guide for some companies that make really popular metal hardware for leg vises. There's some pretty cool ones out there. Shoulder vises were very common in continental Europe, and they have a wide, unobstructed opening that works great for cutting dovetails on wider boards. This type of vise is more complex to make, but well worth it if you can take the time to learn how to make it. This is the style that some of you may remember that Frank Klaus made so popular on his workbench that he released years ago I think it was in Fine Woodworking magazine. This next style of vise has the same name as the category that I'm discussing. I simply call it a face vise. It's another very traditional European type of workbench vise. This vise is usually the same thickness as your workbench top and clamps against the top with either 1 or 2 screw arms. A drawback of this style of vise, in my opinion, is that the screws get in the way of clamping wider boards. Also, if you clamp a wider board in the side of the vise, you need to use a spacer of some sort to keep the vise from racking. There have been some modern designs that have slightly improved upon this design, which I'll mention in further detail in my article. Cast iron vises came about during the mass production era of the Industrial Revolution, and they're typically bolted to the bottom of a workbench top, and wood is usually added to the vise jaws to offer protection to a wooden workpiece, because you don't want metal crimping in on your wood. And while this is a strong style of vise, it doesn't have the traditional look that many woodworkers prefer when they are building a classic style of workbench. But that may not be very important to you. You may not care. I have mine bolted to the workbench in my garage. It's more of a flat workspace. Auxiliary vises, as I call them, are vises that can be clamped to your workbench top, even to a tabletop in your house or a door. If you're, for example, you're waiting to build a workbench and you don't have a workbench. Now, this type of auxiliary vise with double screws is often called a Moxon vise, because the design was featured in Joseph Moxon's book that he wrote in 1703 called Mechanic Exercises. So I love this style of vise for dovetailing large boards, predominantly because it has such a wide space between the wooden screws, or metal screws in some cases. 24 inches, I believe, is what mine is. And it can even be raised up on tall blocks to prevent bending over and have a back strain. Now let's talk about end vises. End vises are used to clamp a workpiece between bench dogs. Bench dogs, if you don't know, are the pieces of wood or metal that stick up in the holes, in these dog holes. And I divide vises into 3 subcategories. Again, this is my terminology. The first style of end vise I'll mention is a tail vise. Like all the end vises, a tail vise moves a bench dog to clamp a workpiece along the length of the workbench. This type of vise also allows the woodworker to clamp a vertical piece of wood between the wooden vise and the cutout section of the workbench top, which I think is pretty cool, and it's a pretty fast way to work on a small piece. A wagon vise works similar to a tail vise, but rather than the entire enclosure moving, just the bench dog moves in an open recess that you cut in the workbench top. This is a much simpler vise to install than a tail vise, and it's the style that I use on most of my workbenches. Doesn't take long to install at all. An end vise, part of the category with the same name, is just like a face vise, but it's attached to the end of a workbench. This type of vise can be useful because it allows you to tighten boards between 2 rows of bench dogs rather than just one. This is helpful if you plan to work on really wide projects like doors or a really wide board. But like the very similar face vise, it does require a spacer to keep the vise screws from racking. Also, I don't find that I hardly ever use the 2 dogs at one time. Another important feature to have on your workbench is legs that are flush with the bench top. This will allow you to clamp long boards or doors to the face of your workbench. A lot of commercial workbench makers, sorry to say, seem to have not done their research, and they manufacture workbenches with tops that overhang the legs. If you've already got a workbench that doesn't have flush legs, don't stress out and go get a new one. You can probably use a spacer board against the workbench leg, attach it somehow, and that should work. So what is the proper height, length, and width for a workbench? There's a lot of people who will tell you exactly what size is best or exactly the rule to size your workbench. But I'd like to tell you that it's all a matter of personal preference and what you plan on doing on your workbench. So what do people say is a proper workbench height? I've heard many times that the workbench should come to your knuckles when you're standing straight up. I'm not sure who made up that rule of thumb, but the ideal height of a workbench totally depends on what's comfortable to you, and it depends on what you're going to be doing on the workbench. I personally like a lower workbench like this because I do a lot of hand planing, and I find that I get a lot more power with so much of my body mass leaning over the hand plane. I find that it's also easier to see what I'm doing when using molding planes, when I need to look at the spring line, or I need to look at the molding that's coming about, or using a rabbet plane or something like that. Yes, at 6 foot 2 inches, my back can get a little tired if I'm leaning over with a lower bench to cut a bunch of joints, but most of the time it's just fine, to be honest. And if, for example, I'm cutting a bunch of dovetails, I can just clamp my Wagon Vise onto this workbench under some blocks to raise it up, or I could sit down. Problem solved. The length of a workbench can vary considerably too, and it largely depends on the space that you've got to work with in your workshop or in your house. Most of my larger workbenches are around 8 feet in length because that was the most economical use of lumber, or how the lumber came cut around that length. These Moravian workbenches, on the other hand, are just over 6 feet long, and I rarely find them to be too short. If a longboard won't fit between the bench dogs, then you can just find another method to hold the board. There's a lot of ways to clamp a board to your workbench. And what about the width? I've heard a lot of woodworkers say that it has to be 24 inches wide. I just find that that's not true. While I do often like a nice wide workbench, I usually base the width off of my workbench off of the material that I have available. For example, this Roubo workbench is 18 inches wide, and this other one behind me happens to be just under 24 inches wide. And so why did I choose those sizes? I didn't. That was just the size of the slabs that came out of the trees, and after I was finished squaring up the boards, that was what they were. Conventional woodworking dogma would say that this Moravian workbench top is way too narrow at 14 inches. But in reality, the majority of hand tool work that I do takes place within the first 6 to 8 inches of the edge of the workbench. If I want to do assemblies or glue-ups, I can just throw a piece of plywood or subflooring or something on top of the workbench top, extending here onto the tool tray, and that'll give me a place for dripping glue onto as well. So it works just fine that way. Now I'll touch on a controversial topic of tool trays. Some people love them, and some people absolutely despise them because they say it makes a mess. I like benches with tool trays, but I also like benches without tool trays. I have multiple benches with and without. My workbenches that are full width also have a space underneath to store my tools, so that's not a problem. But these Moravian workbenches have a really great removable tool tray, and it lets you store your tools, and so it doesn't get messy. These actually pop out and you can dump your shavings on the ground when things get messy. Just don't dump your tools out. If you don't feel really confident in your woodworking skills yet, then I'd like to suggest a really simple and affordable workbench. This French style workbench is made out of southern yellow pine from the hardware store. Yellow pine is a harder softwood and works great for any workbench undercarriages. And it even works fine for workbench tops. That is, if you don't mind that it looks like a workbench and not a fine table. You know what I mean. I buy the 2x12 construction lumber from the hardware store. In fact, a big box store. But it has to be the 16-foot length boards because mills use the best quality trees for those boards. Just don't make the mistake of buying pressure-treated lumber. That would, you don't need an outdoor bench. Also, I've found that the people at the hardware store are more than willing to cut the boards in half to make it easier to get them home. 16 feet is kind of long for anybody's truck. Then I just rip them in half on the bandsaw to get a nice quarter sawn lumber, and I mill my parts from that wood. After that, it's just a matter of laminating the top with glue and doing normal mortise and tenon joinery, which you can see how to do that if you're not familiar with one of my past videos, and I'll link to that below this video. Well, that's probably about as much as you can handle sitting and learning about workbenches at one time. So like I said, you can find much more advice on the accompanying workbench guide. The link is below. And if you have any questions about workbenches or workbench construction, please leave a comment below and I'll try to answer it. And while you're down there, this isn't tough, just give the video a thumbs up if you liked it. And make sure you subscribe to my channel, because in the next video, I'll show all the different workbench fixtures and accessories that I use here in my school, like this. So, I'd like to say thanks for hanging out here at my shop.
This is Joshua Farnsworth. If you're interested in woodworking with a mix of hand tools and power tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find a bunch of free woodworking lessons, workshop tours of amazing woodworkers, and our very popular tool buying guides. You can ask questions and share your projects with thousands of woodworkers on my forum. Enjoy!